tonight virtually to Diane's webinar, which is called Painting the Bunting. And I'm so looking forward to this talk tonight. But again, some housekeeping things. If you have general comments, you can go ahead and put those in the chat during the meeting. But if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A so that we make sure we answer those before the end of the talk. And we'll answer those at the end. And if you need captions, you can get that at the bottom of the Zoom bar under the 3 dots and click captioning. And this meeting is being recorded, so we'll send that out to everybody who is registered within 5 business days of this program. So Diane is a PhD student at the University of Georgia studying painted buntings and their movements and their diets, and is an amazing artist. So I hope you guys enjoy her presentation because it's going to be a lot of fun and promises to teach you a lot about their lives. So you can go ahead, Diane.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks to everyone for spending some of their Wednesday evening. I know y'all probably had crazy plans to come learn about buntings, and I'm excited to talk with you and hopefully won't put anyone to sleep. But let me know if at any time you can't hear me well or need me to speak louder or anything along those lines. I'm just grateful to share this time with y'all. And like Sarah said, today I'm going to be talking about what I think is one of the coolest migratory songbirds that we get here in Georgia called the painted bunting. And so, like Sarah said, I'm Diane. I'm a student in Dr. Clark Rushing's Population Ecology Lab at the University of Georgia, where I'm currently a PhD student. I do a lot of my work on the Georgia coast, where Sarah is the awesome coastal conservation coordinator. And I'm originally from Augusta, Georgia, but I work on Little St. Simons Island, Georgia, and at Wormslow State Historic Site near Savannah, Georgia, where I study painted buntings. But today, I'm not going to talk about my PhD work, which I started not too long ago, but I'm going to instead talk about some of the master's work I did in the same lab, studying painted buntings on Little St. Simons Island. And as a quick warning, if you were expecting a really serious numbers, data heavy talk, this is not it. And if anyone was at BirdFest this summer with Birds Georgia, you might have heard a similar talk. So as a quick warning, it's not going to be too data heavy, but hopefully I will not put you to sleep. Unless you want to fall asleep, then maybe it'll help you do that. But it'll be a little bit of a different talk. And I don't know about you all, but I've always really had an affinity for picture books. One, because they're often just so beautiful. I mean, there's beautiful artists who create them. And 2, because I have a hard time with words and they use very few words. And 3, they just, I don't know about y'all, but they have a really elegant way of taking complex storylines with different characters and plots and distilling it into a narrative thread that can be understood by people of all different ages, all different backgrounds. And as I've become more into the field of science, I really kind of tried to view science in a similar way, where we have all of these characters, be it birds or plants, that are interacting with each other, forming these narrative lines. And as scientists, it's our jobs to kind of try and find what stories that are going on around us are most important to tell, or we feel might be most impactful in the communities where we live. And in science, we're at a really exciting time where there's all kinds of cool technologies, be it radio technologies or genetic technologies, that are allowing us to tell new stories that haven't been told before, which is a cool time to be a grad student and kind of push at the frontiers of science and the knowledge of what we know about these birds that we love and care about. Which is important because I'm sure, as y'all know, all around the world, we're losing the stories of different ecosystems, be they grasslands, freshwater wetlands, deserts, and habitat preservation and conservation is a really valuable way to help protect these ecosystems, but a lot of them have been degraded to a state where restoring them, like some of the awesome work that Birds Georgia is doing on Jekyll Island, has become really important to preserve them to a state where birds and snakes and humans can all thrive in those places. But a question that we often ask is, okay, we have these ecosystem, we want to restore it to a place where it's really great for birds and turtles and snakes, but what do we actually restore it to? And when we think of these places as a story, they have all of these characters, but we know that the things that birds and mice and snakes need differs over time because they have different periods of their life where maybe they're raising young and other times they're trying to get a lady or a man. And that leads to them needing different foods and different plants. So we know that changes over time, just like it changes over time for us humans. As a wee little 5-year-old, I did not eat or need the same foods that I need now as a older person. Um, and for a lot of animals, be they birds or mice or rattlesnakes, plants are kind of the keystone that animals need in order to exist on a landscape. So a bird might eat seeds, but it also might eat caterpillars, and both of those things need a plant to exist on the landscape. So plants and knowing the plants that things that we're concerned about like is really important for restoring a lot of landscapes. And that's especially true for at least one of my favorite types of ecosystems, grasslands. Around the world, grasslands are the most endangered, most threatened, and least protected of all ecosystems, which makes me a little sad. Who doesn't love grass? I don't know, some people probably. And around the world, we've lost over 90% of them. And that's especially true here in the Southeast. As you see kind of on this picture of the southeastern US, all the green areas are areas that are historically thought to have contained a lot of grasslands in the southeast. And you see that that's a lot of the state of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. And for southeastern grasslands, more animal and plant species depend on them than in the entire Great Plains of the US and Canada. And a really renowned ecologist, E.O. Wilson, also stated that they're the richest terrestrial biome in North America. So kind of cool, kind of important, but we've lost a lot of them. And that's especially true where I work and where some of y'all are from in the southeastern coastal plain of Georgia and other states, where we've lost over 90% of a type of grassland called maritime grasslands. In maritime grasslands, there are these beautiful grasslands mainly composed of muley grass, which, if anyone's on the coast right now, have like big pink plumes. They're often also used in ornamental decorations. But these grasslands exist near the beach, which is where people want to live. So they're really threatened, and we've lost a lot of them. And they're threatened due to habitat loss from development. So they exist near the beach, which is where people want to build houses, and I don't blame them. People love living near the beach. Sea level rise, altered hydrology due to neighborhoods being put near these grasslands and water being withdrawn, changing what plants can live there. And thus, these maritime grasslands are threatened and have become the focus of a lot of restoration and management attention, especially through fire, to kind of cut back on trees growing on the landscape and support different grasses. And that is especially true. Oh, sorry. And within these maritime grasslands, there are all kinds of stories going on within them, and all kinds of threatened organisms, but also cultural practices as humans that exist within them. So you see prairie warblers in these grasslands. You see one bird that I really like, but maybe is not as showy as a painted bunting, common ground doves. They're so cute, especially in the hand. They're like purple and pink. Painted buntings, of course, that beautiful muley grass in the middle here, eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, island glass lizards. And the Gullah Geechee people who have inhabited these grasslands historically use the muley grass in their sweet grass beautiful basket making. So they're just really important across the board. And when we think of these grasslands of all the characters going on in them, there's one in particular who you could say, at least in my mind, and a lot of birders' mind, might be the star of the show or the main character, and that's painted buntings. And so we thought that painted buntings could be a great way to serve as a flagship species to make people care about these grasslands and learn more about them and the birds itself. Because honestly, for all of their beauty and splendor and colorfulness, there's a lot that we don't know about painted buntings, and honestly, a lot of migratory songbirds in general. But what we do know is that First and foremost, they are the most objectively the most beautiful, cute little songbird that I think we find here in Georgia. So this rainbow bird here is a adult male. This male is at least 2 years old. And then any other painted bunting that you see, if it's a green bird, it could be a variety of different ages. So green colored painted buntings are any kind of female. They can also be young males that are up to 2 years old. And any juvenile bird who's just a baby is green as well. So if you see any of these colorful folks here, that's a painted bunting. And personally, I have an affinity for the green birds. They're one of our few naturally green songbirds here in North America. And I mean, who doesn't love a green bird? Anyways, so painted buntings, they have two distinct subpopulations in the US. There's one in the West, which it occurs and breeds and makes their babies in Texas and Arkansas, and then migrates all the way down to Central America in the winter. And then we have our buntings that we see here in Georgia, which are part of the eastern subpopulation. They breed along the coast of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and some of Florida, and even go in to the interior of Georgia to places like Augusta, Statesboro, which I saw some folks were from. And then they go and migrate in the winter to South Florida, the Caribbean, Cuba. But when the work that I've done with these buntings has focused on where they are during the breeding season, because that's when they're, doing their thing, making their nests, making babies, and it's an important time for furthering the population. And when they're breeding in Georgia and other places across the Southeast, they occupy a variety of habitats. Beautiful maritime forests, like you might see on Jekyll Island, maritime scrub, salt marsh, more pine, hardwood forest. But today we're going to focus on buntings that occupy those maritime grasslands during the breeding season. And just like the grasslands, painted buntings are beautiful, but they face a lot of threats, like a lot of our migratory songbirds, due to loss of their breeding habitat, because they like to breed in coastal areas where a lot of the humans are moving and building houses. And they're also really taken by the pet trade across their range, especially for our eastern subpopulation of birds. So the males, they're beautiful, they sing beautifully. Who doesn't love to see one in nature? Well, some folks also like to have them as pets illegally. And so that's really taken some of our rainbow, older adult male painted buntings that you see. And then also sea level rise, losing some of the marshes and grasslands that they rely on, which I don't know about you, makes me kind of sad. Thus, across the board by state, federal, non-governmental organizations, and academics, restoring habitat for buntings is viewed as important. And that's especially true at the cool place where I'm lucky enough to do research on Little St. Simons Island, Georgia. Some of y'all might have been there, some might not have, but it's a really, really cool barrier island located off the coast of Georgia. It's one of the least developed of our barrier islands. Pretty much none of it is developed except a small eco lodge that hosts up to 32 guests on the island. And they're known for birds and birding, but there's also a lot of cool stuff going on there. So we have little loggerhead sea turtle hatchlings that arise in the fall, oh my gosh, in the summer and crawl to the sea. We have, it's a big hotspot for butterfly migration. So we have butterflies like this white peacock butterfly that come through the island in droves. And we have birds like shorebirds like this American oyster catcher eating a little cannonball ball jelly that you can all see on the island. It's just such a cool place to go. But in particular, they have a lot of painted buntings. In fact, my boss, who's so wonderful, who I worked for, Dr. Clark Rushing, he started this work on Little St. Simons because they traveled all across the southeastern coast, and Little St. Simons was the place where they saw the most buntings. And it's also a place that has some of the most extant maritime grassland of anywhere along the southeastern shorebirds. Oh my gosh, southeastern seaboard. So it's just a really, really cool place. And so when we were thinking, okay, what's the story that we're going to try and learn more about to tell us more about these birds? We had a lot of questions, but kind of settled on two main stories that I hope to tell that we didn't know much about for these birds, which is where are they spending time and what exactly are they eating, which we really didn't know too much of for them. And we wanted to see in particular how where they spend time and what they eat differs between males and females. Because just like humans, males and female birds have different roles. The females, they're the ones taking care of the babies and raising the babies. The male buntings, they really, I have not seen males help much raise the young, but they have to sing and look pretty, so they probably eat different things. And then how does what they eat and where they spend time doing their different behaviors, different activities, all relate to plants? Because in order to restore the habitats that these birds rely on, we need to restore the plants that the activities that these birds do need. And so when telling the story of where the birds spend time, we wanted to see how where they spend time relates to the plants that they need, how fire impacts these plants, because the island burns the grasslands to try and maintain them. So we kind of wanted to quantify how effective that burning really is, to ultimately link these management actions that the island is having with what the birds are doing. And so you might be like, Diane, well, how do you do all this? Well, first, to learn about the birds, we have to safely capture the birds, and we do this using mist nets, and we quickly and safely apply a little aluminum band on them that allows us to tell one individual from the other. We age and sex them by looking at them in the hand. You look at different feather qualities and different parts on their belly to see if they're a male or a female. And then we put little kind of like a rock climbing harness backpack on these birds that emits a radio signal every couple of seconds that will allow us to learn where the bird is traveling. And the way that we did this was a kind of really cool emerging way, something called automated radio telemetry. And how this functions exactly is a bird has a little backpack on that emits a radio signal. It goes beep, 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 kind of like your radio at home or in your car. And there's these little kind of mini radio stations set up across the landscape that pick up that radio tag every time it signals. And so here's kind of what it looks like. It has a solar panel on top, the little radio tower that charges it so it can pick up a bird that has a tag on its back. And we have found, very scientifically that these little radio towers are also great at attracting birds that aren't buntings. Like here's a picture of a common nighthawk that used it as his perch. I saw this bird on the little tower every day. But we've also seen things like black-bellied whistling ducks using the perches. I've had an American kestrel. I've had a mockingbird that made it its defense area, and it had a big old thing of poop that it kept on it. Had a wood stork land on one once and stand on it, which I thought was really impressive. But that's all besides the fact. And so what we did is with these little radio towers, we set them up in grids across maritime grasslands on the island to try and track the movement of the birds. And the grasslands that we set them up at, the island does a really awesome job of burning different areas of grasslands at different intervals over years. So like one could have been burned a year ago, one burned 2 years ago, which would allow us to track how they use grasslands that are burned in different ways. And how it works is a bird with a tag is flying through the grid of these little devices that pick up the radio signals, and each device kind of gets the approximate area of where the bird is. From there, and a lot of math, I can get the approximate area of where the bird was spending time. And then we simulate a lot of trajectories using math, which math is awesome, especially through the context of birds. I mean, it makes it so much more fun. And simulate a lot of tracks for where the bird could have traveled to kind of get a heat map of, okay, this is where the bird is spending a lot of time. Here's where it's spending a lot less time, to kind of, without me having to be in the field all the time, getting really like minute by minute details of where these birds traveled, which is really cool and new technology. And so that was kind of looking at, okay, where are the birds spending time? But we also wanted to see how where they eat differs across grasslands that are burned at different intervals and according to what vegetation is there. And to do that, I just went out in the field and honestly watched a lot of buntings foraging and recorded where they were eating and then did plant surveys of what those birds were eating. But from that radio telemetry data of looking at where they spend time, this is kind of what it looked like of where the birds spend time. A lot of really cool shapes and colors. And what we found from all of this was that in areas that had been burned just like 1 to 2 years ago, we found that birds foraged in them more than other areas. And in particular, they had a higher probability of eating in areas that had a lot more native grasses, opposed to things like just shrubs or like small little forbs, which are little plants that you might see under grasses or maybe like shrubs. And we found that in particular, there were birds were more likely to forage again in 1 to 2 years post burn, areas where there's a lot of native grasses. But we found that areas that had never been burned, or at least never had been recorded that they were burned, did not have many native grasses, which when I was out there watching the birds, they eat a lot of and they really like. And when we were when I was out there in the field, I mentioned that we did these plant surveys, and what we found is that areas that had never been burned had a lot of non-native grasses, which we didn't see the birds eating as much. While areas that had been burned maybe not too long ago, like 0 to 1 years or 2 to 3 years, had a lot more native grasses. And areas that had just been burned also had a lot of forbs and also non-native grasses, but those there were less and less non-native grasses over time after a burn. Okay, and so that was us kind of trying to tell the story of, okay, where are these birds spending time? How does it relate to plants? And how does the management that the island do relate to all that? But we also kind of wanted to get more into what they were eating because I was doing these surveys, but it's hard to watch what birds eat. I mean, they go down into the grass and then they're gone. You can't see them. And it's like, were they actually eating this or were they eating this? And birds, like many humans, again, we think that what they eat over time differs depending on what activity they're doing, if they're nesting, if they're molting and changing their feathers, or if they're just hanging out with their young, and that this probably differs between males and females. And like with humans, with the importance of food to birds, you would think that scientists would know, the specific foods that birds rely on. But except for chickens and maybe like quail, we really don't, which is kind of crazy because not all foods are equally valuable to birds, both in terms of, how good they taste. Because I don't know about y'all, but there are some foods I want to eat, but I don't want to eat just because I don't like how they taste, but also nutrition, because food items, just like for us humans, differ in the amount of protein and fat and sugars that are in them. And this is really important, especially from a restoration standpoint, because if a bird is eating insects, over 90% of our phytophagous insects or insects that eat plants depend on a host. So these insects, over 90% of them that eat plants rely on the presence of a certain plant to be on the landscape in order for that plant to exist. Think of a monarch butterfly. It needs the milkweed to exist. The same goes for a lot of our less well-studied little critters. And, we can't really successfully manage for a bird that's declining without knowing what it eats, because maybe it really likes to eat this certain type of caterpillar or family of caterpillars for some reason, and those need oaks. And if oaks aren't there, well, then the caterpillars aren't going to be there, and then the birds aren't going to be there. So we aim to tell a story of what foods they're eating. And to do this, we wanted to see, okay, what foods are out in the grasslands for these birds? And then look at, okay, what foods are there, but what are they actually eating? And then see if it differs between males and females, all so that we can identify important plants for these cool little birdies. And so to do this, we sampled all of these plants that are highly abundant on the landscape in Little St. Simons Island, both in the grasslands, the marsh, the maritime forest, shrub scrub areas. And we did surveys called beat sheet surveys, where you go out in the grasslands, like my awesome volunteer Rain here, and you either get a bundle of grass or you get a tree branch, you hit it 3 times, and all of the food items, whether it be insects or spiders or berries or seeds on that plant fall onto the sheet and you collect it all. And so we did that for all of those plants we just mentioned to see what foods are there. But we wanted to see what foods they eat. And you might be thinking, Diane, well, how did you do that? Did you watch the birds? Well, yes, but for this, we did something very exciting, at least to me, is we got their poop. And so to do that, when I mentioned how we catch birds earlier and how we ban them, often during that process, within like a minute or so of capture, birds will poop. And so we put the birds in a baggie, like here, and the bird poops very quickly. We remove the bird, release them, and then we collect their poop sample into a nice little vial. And then we're doing this really cool new genetic process called DNA metabarcoding, where you take the little beautiful poop sample, you extract DNA from it, and then you're able to tell what plants and animals that bird ate. And we were really interested in what plants and animals buntings eat because they're omnivorous. So they eat both plants and insects and spiders. And so we have this cool little process where you get kind of the DNA sequences of everything that was in the poop, and then you match it up to the DNA sequences that exist for different species of plants and caterpillars and spiders to see exactly what was in each poop sample from each bird, which is kind of cool. At least I think so. Okay, so when seeing what foods were available on the landscape, what we found is that, the stage right before birds start raising and making their babies, there were a lot of seeds on the landscape and a whole lot of caterpillars or lepidopterans. Then over time, those kind of decreased once it got to the breeding or more baby making time. And then after the birds were done with making their babies, we saw that there were a lot more berries on the landscape. Seeds started to increase some as well. And so those are the general patterns we saw with, okay, what's out there for those birds. And then when we looked at the really cool genetic sampling of their poop, what we found is that these birds were eating a lot more arthropods than we thought. So again, there hasn't been a lot of study into what a lot of migratory songbirds eat. And the last scientific study on what buntings eat was done in the 1950s by looking at the stomach contents of dead buntings under a microscope, which isn't as anatomically, oh my gosh, taxonomically accurate as, some genetic sampling technologies that we have. But what we found is they were eating a lot of insects and spiders, which was kind of new. There were spiders in almost all of the birds' poop samples, a lot of caterpillars as well, some beetle larvae, some different types of flies, some grasshoppers, which was all really exciting. And then we also saw a lot of plants come up in the bird's poop that showed what they ate. In particular, we saw a lot of kind of humble grasses that you sometimes see in the maritime grasslands, such as the genus Dicanthelium, which kind of looks like this here. And then a lot of bristle grasses, which are called Ceterias. We saw a lot of those in the bird's poop. But then we also saw things like asters or seaside goldenrod, and different types of oaks in the bird's poop. And you might be thinking, oaks? Well, what are birds eating from an oak tree? Are they eating an acorn? That'd be really cool if they did. I would love to see that. But the cool thing about this technology is that it amplifies the DNA that's, directly in the things that a bird ate. So if it ate a seed, we would see that, it ate the seed. If it ate a spider, we would see that it ate the spider. But it also shows us the DNA of the things that the bird ate. So a lot of caterpillars rely on oaks in order to exist. They're their host plant. So we think that we had a lot of the caterpillars that these birds ate oaks, and then that came up a lot through our sampling process. They also ate a lot of a forb called Paritaria, so it was just really cool stuff and was new for our birds here on the East Coast. Here's kind of what some of those species I mentioned look like. Piptocacium, black dropseed, is one plant that we saw them eat a lot. Kind of emerges in the early summer, late spring. Dicanthelium, little grasses that aren't commercially grown, but almost every time I went into the grasslands, I saw a bird eating dicanthelium, and it came up in the poop samples like crazy. Cetaria species are bristle grasses, um, Paritaria, a little forb, and we also saw them eating some exotic roadside grasses like bahia. And then here are some of the plants that we think function more as host plants for the different caterpillars and other arthropods that these birds ate. So we have Solidago sempervirens or seaside goldenrod, which might still be yellow on the Georgia coast. I think so. Some groundsel bush, some wax myrtle, which the tree swallows love. Um, some pepper vine, and then here's an example of like a caterpillar that the bird would eat, or a geometrid, which often relies on oak trees, and a different type of spider, because these birds ate a lot of spiders, and spiders are good in protein, which is kind of cool. And so you might be like, well, what'd you find? Well, what we found is we wanted to look at, okay, are these birds eating anything that's on the landscape more than it exists? So are they kind of showing like a quasi preference for foods? And what we found is that, what birds ate relative to what was on the landscape didn't vary too much between males and females. We saw that they ate a lot of caterpillars at the beginning of the season, kind of when there were more caterpillars, and then a lot more towards the end of when they're raising their babies. And we saw that they ate a lot of arthropods that weren't caterpillars or spiders. So like grasshoppers, flies, other little dudes kind of at the beginning of their breeding season. And then after they were done raising their young, that, consumption started to spike up more. And we saw those general trends, which is kind of cool because you'd think that in the breeding season, these birds are eating a lot of caterpillars and a lot of arthropods to kind of get their protein to raise their young, but also take care of themselves, which must be hard. I mean, as a human, in my limited way of knowing, I can only imagine raising a child and doing it as a bird and trying to find food to eat where you don't know where things are and there's not a grocery store must be crazy. So yeah, it was kind of cool to see these general trends, and the birds ate a lot more seeds kind of after they were done raising their babies. And so throughout all of this, you may be like, okay, Diane, I might be asleep, I might not. You're talking, what does this all mean? And through all of this, through this research, what we were trying to do were kind of weave these narrative stories of where the birds spend time and what they eat to inform management on Little St. Simon's Island and on the coast in general for these beautiful birds, and to weave kind of this little textile of information that can be used by people maybe studying buntings or who want to apply this work to another species. And what we found was that fire seemed to be good for our grasslands for promoting a lot of the plants that these birds like, especially native grasses and especially not long after burning, because we saw that these birds were eating a lot of these grasses because we love the native grasses. And we also found that there are a lot of, plants and arthropods that we didn't know before that were pretty important for these birds to persist on the landscape. So they ate a whole lot of spiders. They ate a whole lot of dicanthelium and cetaria grasses, which I didn't know much about before doing this research. And they also relied on things like seaside goldenrod and oaks to provide a lot of the different insects that they also need to raise their young and have their babies, but also take care of themselves, self-care. And yeah, those are some of the names that we just said. But throughout all of this, we also learned that emerging technologies, like the genetic technology that we use to look at what they ate through their poop, and the radiotelemetry technologies that helped us see where they moved on the landscape, can be really important tools to answer questions that people might have about other declining species that exist in also other declining or managed landscapes, which was kind of fun, kind of cool. I never thought I'd do so much technology stuff as a bird person, but you go where the wind takes you, and it's always a fun ride. And so we kind of tried to link how management relates to the plants on the landscape and relates to the food for these birds so that we could apply it to where these birds live on Little St. Simon's Island. And I mean, look at these maritime grasslands. Aren't they so beautiful? I don't know. At least I think they are. Every morning, I had like the honor of being able to bike out to these grasslands and stand at them in the sunrise. It's often kind of dewy. I'd get a little wet, both from sweat and from dew on the plants, and watch as the sun rose kind of above the wax myrtles on the horizon and illuminated the dew on the grass stems as, prairie warblers or painted buntings sang in the distance, and maybe like a common nighthawk zhoosh from overhead. And in that moment, I guess I'm a scientist, but I just felt really grateful to be able to feel all the feelings that I felt in these ecosystems and have a place where I could just go and be and observe the birds and observe all of the life that exists outside of ourselves that is often so easy to disregard. And in those moments, it sounds cliche and a little silly, but I kind of fell in love with these grasslands. And I don't know about you all, but there's a poet I really like. Her name is Mary Oliver, and she has one quote that says, "Attention without feeling is only a report." And I know for sure that if I didn't feel the way I felt in these grasslands, both for, the spiders and snakes and grasses in them, but also the birds, that I wouldn't have cared as much to do the work that I did, especially when being eaten by mosquitoes and biting flies and um, questioning my existence. Because, attention is the only currency that we really have on this planet. And what we put our attention to is what we put our life to. And she has another quote because she's amazing, rest in peace, called "Attention is," where she says, "Attention is the beginning of devotion." And I truly felt that being out there in those ecosystems, and um, honored to be out there with those birds and just spend time and learn from them because they know way more than we know, and they know more than we'll never know, which is kind of the beauty of it all. And with these beautiful birds like these buntings and also the maritime grasslands, um, it's hard to not see them and love them, but it's also, something that we know is threatened and that we know that we're losing. And that, with every new development, we lose kind of more of the feelings and creatures that exist without them, and the beautiful quilt work pattern, especially here in the southeast of our ecosystems, kind of goes away. But the cool thing is that as humans, we're the ones who've made a lot of these decisions, but we're also the ones who can make decisions to reverse them and kind of serve as threads to tie it back together. And, one of the great ways that we can do this is community science. For this research, honestly, I relied a fair amount on community science to learn more about the different insects and plants that are out there on the landscape. And iNaturalist, if any folks have this app, which I'm sure you'll know way about this more than I do, about any kind of organism that you see out out there. And there's an iNaturalist project called the Georgia Grasslands Initiative, where you can, especially if you live in the Piedmont area of Georgia, record the grasses that you see to fill a lot of the knowledge gaps about them, because grasses, I mean, they're ubiquitous. Ubiquitous. You see them everywhere, but there's a lot that we don't know about them. And a lot of really basic stuff like what grasses exist where? What do they do? Like, what is this called? So there's a lot we don't know about them, and that's kind of spearheaded by UGA State Botanical Garden. Also, eBird is a really great way to learn more about where, for people like me who maybe don't know an area very well, learning more about where a lot of birds are that are declining so that we can try and protect those areas moving forward. Birds Georgia, as I'm sure y'all know, also has a really great wildlife sanctuary program, which would be great for species like buntings that are declining. As I'm sure a lot of y'all know, buntings are actually feeder birds. So we find them a lot at bird feeders where they really like a type of seed called white prosome millet. But they also really like a lot of native grasses that can be incorporated to landscapes if you live on the coast to promote habitat for them and other birds. And there's a lot of great native plant resources throughout Georgia, both on the coast, like coastal wildscapes and the state botanical garden, um, where you can buy some great plants. And especially now, supporting land conservation and legislation for birds is really important. And all of these organizations here, especially Birds Georgia, is doing really great work to protect the spaces where both birds and people thrive on the coast and throughout the state and region. And just like anything, or just like any ecosystem, throughout this talk, it was a lot of whatever. But this project was a collaboration of a lot of great folks working together. And making things happen. And here are some of the wonderful folks there. Dr. Cooper, who some of y'all might know, Dr. Clark Greshing, my boss, and then the wonderful staff on Little St. Simon's Island, Aurora Bard, Scott, and then Dr. Cody Cox, who is wonderful as well, and the Barrows, who support this project. And thank you to all the folks listed here as well who have helped support this research, and everyone at Birds Georgia, Heather, Sarah, Adam, who have helped make this work a reality and made it fun and exciting and silly. Um, Thanks to all of our partners and funding organizations for this work. And if y'all have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. So yeah, I think that's enough me talking for right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Diane. That was amazing. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but if people have them, please put them in the Q&A and we can get them answered. But I have a question about bunting. So, with your telemetry, did you have any buntings that were kind of wild, kind of all over the place? You couldn't predict where they were going, or they messed up your data?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sarah. I can let me pull up one of the little maps. So we calculated the home ranges of where these buntings spent time, and that's shown kind of the area where a bird is most of the time throughout, the breeding season. And here are some visuals of that. And as you see, some of them are really big, and some of them are a lot bigger than the grids that we have. So one of the limitations of using these radio telemetry grids is that they can only detect a tag from a certain distance away. So you have to set them up a certain distance apart from each other. And birds, they're awesome and they fly and they can fly really far. And so a lot of our birds, didn't spend all of their time within those grids and flew elsewhere, which we know they do, especially to visit bird feeders or maybe to forage in the salt marsh or maybe forage out in the maritime forest. And so, yeah, we got we got kind of some crazy predictions of where the birds spent time based off of, we could only cover a certain area and we know the birds are traveling outside of that. So in a perfect world, we would just cover the landscape with these little towers, but we are not rich enough to do that. So we just put them in the grasslands and we still got some cool data, but that's a great question.
Awesome. And I think so. I don't know. I don't remember if you mentioned this, but do the tags they come off at the end of the season, or are you able to predict or see where they go in the non-breeding season?
Yeah, so for the tags, they either fall off the birds after a year, or when we recaught them, we would remove the tags. But they also work for the rest of that whole year. So if a bird is migrating down, say to like the eastern coast of Florida or down towards maybe Miami, those tags could be picked up by those towers so we could see where it was migrating to. All of these tags are compatible with something called MODIS towers. And MODIS is this big kind of international collaboration among bird scientists where we're trying to learn more about where birds migrate. Because for a lot of birds, we don't know the exact routes and locations that they migrate to. And so there's towers. We have a tower on Little St. Simon's Island. There's towers all throughout the state of Georgia that help us learn more about where birds migrate. And these tags that we put on the birds are kind of part of that greater system.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any questions? Anybody? I'll share my screen for a second, Diane, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Thank you. So anybody who is in Georgia, oh, am I sharing? Yeah. Okay. Anybody who is in Georgia, we do have some community science projects that you could get involved in involving painted buntings. So like we mentioned, we don't exactly know. We know where they winter, sort of, but we do know that they're spending more and more time here on the Georgia coast. And so, if you do have painted buntings spending the whole season with you, whether they're just there for a month or two, you can fill out our Google form on this QR code down here, and we would love to know where they're spending time with you, and potentially work with you to learn more about those birds in your backyard feeders. And then also across the whole country, um, Climate Watch is 2 times a year. So in the winter and in the summer, it's a 1 month long window, and you just go out one day during that time period, and you count birds in a square that you select. And painted buntings are one of the species that the Climate Watch program looks at. So we actually don't have anybody in Georgia who has claimed painted buntings, so they're all wide open. So if you live on the coast, you can claim a square for painted buntings. You go to 12 different sites and look for them, and basically check yes or no if you saw them. Or if you live in like Augusta or Statesboro or anywhere else that might have painted buntings, whether it's summer or winter, you can join Climate Watch and actually contribute to that citizen science. But also eBird is kind of a gold mine also. So if you contribute to eBird, that is always much appreciated as well. And Gretchen says hi from Wormslow.
Hi, Gretchen.
Awesome. So if you don't have any questions, then I think that's it. And that was amazing, Diane. So thank you so much for your time. And again, this was recorded, so we'll post this within 5 business days. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday evening. Thank
Have a great
you.
one.